It is an honor and a privilege to bring you two of my favorite stories. Gen Z could be the most conservative generation ever. Wow. We love to talk about it. I often talk about how abortion and sterilization will result in the future generations of this country being substantially more conservative. Because liberals don't have kids, conservatives do, and that's all that really matters. But my friends, this would not be a complete Timcast news story without civil war. From the Daily Mail, younger Americans fearing 2024 election could spark a civil war are prepping for disaster. 40% of Gen Z have spent money on doomsday preparations, new survey finds. Considering this pure confirmation bias, I should be like the biggest news personality among Gen Z. Or maybe it's because I'm a big news personality, Gen Z thinks these things. No, I think the reality is Gen Z, the product of conservatives who have more kids, have these tendencies. And that is to say, I don't believe that Gen Z as a monolith is conservative or believes civil war is coming and are prepping. As we saw, it's only about 40%. But that could be the plurality. The issue, of course, being, as I often say, in the 2000s, liberals stopped having kids. I mean, they're having kids, but they're having 1.43, I think it was, and conservatives are having 2.05. That means for every 4 people, 3 of them are going to be conservative. What do you get? Okay, it's about 20 years on. And we're seeing Donald Trump actually winning among the younger generations. We are seeing the young far left extremists and non-binary progressive and pro-Palestine stuff. But I think when it comes to breaking down Gen Z, you're probably going to find the right is larger. That is to say, there will be many Gen Z people who don't consider themselves Republicans, don't like conservatives, are fairly moderate, but this puts them in the right-leaning camp. So there's a bunch of different factions among those who would consider themselves to be Gen Z, but the right is more dominant, at least in terms of what ideas overlap with each other. That is to say, while there are large groups of woke Gen Zers, they don't make up a very large faction of Gen Z at all and are probably in the minority. But this is funny because I got to slow down just a little bit. Could Gen Z be the most conservative generation ever? Well, it's weird. They are somewhat conservative in some ways, but I do think a lot of these polls are actually getting some of this stuff wrong. This story, this is from Financial Review, actually does get it a little bit wrong. They're arguing that because the Gen Z is going out less, having less sex, and losing their virginity later, they're conservative, when in reality, society is probably just breaking down. But I actually have an argument and an opinion on this. And that is, yes, these things will lead to a more conservative generation. And I think that's what we're seeing. As Gen Z watches the world crumble around them, the failures of the millennial generation and what's to come, they're probably thinking like, we need to start fixing things. And that's what makes things interesting. Seeing that high school Gen Z males are leaning more conservative, they dipped down a little bit after 2020, and seeing that they're prepping. Oh boy. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you the conservative Gen Z generation prepping for a civil war. How about that? Financial Review writes, the Lamb Queue outside Fabric, famous London nightclub, stretches 150 meters around the corner despite the drizzle. It is Freshers Week and the students sway and cling to one another behind the barriers. Others mill near the entrance, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't look very different from when I started university just over a decade ago. But when I started speaking to students, their lives seem quite different. They tell me they go out once a week, much less than my peers. When I repeat this later in the night, I'm assured by others that once a week is on the higher, more debauched end. Often they say it's more of a case of once a month. Are Gen Z uniquely socially conservative? There are 2 dominant opposing theories about this generation, which is generally defined as those born between 96 and 2012, or between the ages of 11 and 27. On the one hand, they appear more free-thinking and progressive than any generation before them. Sex-positive, anti-racist, and waving the flag for identity politics, with words such as cis and non-binary part of their daily lexicon. On the other hand, as my non-scientific poll of the Fabric Fresher suggests, they are in some way more abstemious. Modern-day social conservatism has evolved into a response to the extreme liberalization of Western society through the sexual revolution, the breakdown of traditional family structures, immigration, and the decline of religion. Its beliefs don't necessarily map neatly onto those of the Conservative Party, It was David Cameron who legalized gay marriage as prime minister in 2013. And there exists a blue labor faction grounded in cultural conservatism. But I must stop our good friend writing this review and point out what he doesn't understand is the bifurcation. He sees Gen Z as a monolith. Oh, it's interesting when you ask Gen Z, they don't go out. But it's also interesting that they are also sex positive. No, no, no. Those are two completely different factions. When you look at those who are going out and partying and doing sex clubs and things like that, yeah, you found the progressive, non-binary, using the word cis and everything like that. What you're not finding is the people who don't go out, who are not leaning in this direction. That is to say, as I've said several times, it's a mass bifurcation of the generation. So if you were to pull them all together, you might find, well, they're very progressive, but also strangely conservative. No, you're mixing two very distinct groups. And that is what is very, very interesting. Quote, Gen Z long for a political offer that satisfies their nostalgia for the things they've never known. Marriage, parochial life, and national pride. I think that's true. And I think it's because Gen Z got a tiny piece of it and millennials got a little bit more. But I recently went to, where was I? I was at the Zoomies. I was skating the other day and I was wearing this checkered Vans belt and people were like, where was it? From Hot Topic from 2003? And I'm like, no, it was from Zoomies yesterday. I don't know. I just bought a belt. They're good belts for skating in. But there was a young woman there who's probably in her mid-20s. Okay, so Gen Z. And I can't remember what song came on. It was a song from like 99 or something. And I went, oh boy, oldies, you know, because it's been almost 25 years. And she was like, oh, I live in the 90s. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy. I mean, I guess people like the 80s too. But I do think that a lot of Gen Z, man, it must really suck to be Gen Z. Those of us millennials, we got to experience the last decade. And I think for Gen Z, it's almost like you're looking into a fake version of reality that doesn't exist and never existed, as if we're in some kind of simulation. And the stories of the United States predating the 2000s are just manufactured to facilitate your existence. Meaning, we know the 20s, we know the 30s, we know the 40s, the 50s. All of these decades have a distinct feel to them. Now, I think the 20s and the 30s have their moments, right? You got World War I, you got the Great Depression, and you've got iconic imagery related to these decades. The 50s are when things really solidified. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s were such unique time periods that almost flipped on a dime. That is 79 into 81, and it was like, bang, the American culture was totally different. Now, of course, it overlaps because it's not digital, it's analog, right? It's waves. So you get a little bit of the late 70s into the 80s. You know, obviously Queen persisted from the 70s and the 80s. They changed their look. The 80s had a very distinct style. If you're a millennial born in the 80s or early 90s, you experienced some of the last decade. But for Gen Z born in the mid to late 90s and 2000s, they weren't actively participating in culture for several years after that, at a time when culture was actually washing away. And now you've got people who want to live in a decade and they don't. Let me tell you, my friends, go to the mall. You know what really blows my mind? Any mall you go to that's got a Hot Topic, they've got Nightmare Before Christmas merch everywhere. Yo, when I was like 15 years old, okay, we're talking, I think like 2002 ish, 2002, 2003. Between 2001 and 2002. Nightmare Before Christmas had been out for a long time already. And so all the young people who grew up watching that movie, who are now teenagers, are buying the Jack Skellington beanies with the things hanging down or whatever, wearing Nightmare Before Christmas shirts. Yo, it's been 30 years, okay? And they're still plastering these stores with this stuff. And I'm like, why is there a 19-year-old buying that? Okay, I guess. I mean, in the 90s and the 2000s, you'd buy Zeppelin stuff from the 70s. But this store has never changed. It's the same thing. And I'm like, time stopped. I wonder if that's why many of Gen Z just are living in the way living in the world that they are, wanting to have this nostalgia. Perhaps. But here's what I love about all of this. Gen Z ain't stupid. Now, again, I'm not going to mishmash two different distinct worlds, which is progressive and right-leaning. I don't say conservative because the right means something different today. I think that you have a large percentage, it looks like 40% of Gen Z adults are actually concerned about social collapse and decay. And they're smart. And I respect this. It's not about whether civil war happens or the country collapses. It's actually quite simple. Sometimes it rains. So we often do promos for safeandreadymeals.com. Emergency food supplies. I don't do them all that. I don't do them that often. We only shout out safeandreadymeals.com typically when there actually is some kind of disaster. And the reason being is that, look, you got a first aid. This is the pitch I always give is you've got a first aid kit. When was the last time you used it? Okay. We've got one downstairs. It's never been touched. It's like, I mean, you get a cut on your hand, you go to the first aid kit, but we don't even, like, it's there. We know where it is. It's mounted on the wall. So everybody knows where it is. For a lot of people, they don't even know where it is. And so I always say, you barely use it, but you got one. Well, you eat every day. You drink water every day. At least I hope. What's your emergency plan for this? I think Gen Z gets it. It's not about the world ending. It's just really simple. Are you prepared for a disaster? Are you thinking ahead? This is why I think Gen Z is got a lot of smart people, smarter than millennials. Millennials are completely broken, by the way. Let's read this from the Daily Mail. Younger Americans fearing 2024 election could spark a civil war are prepping for disaster. They say Gen Z adults born after 97, that's the generation, is the most likely to be prepping for a disaster, with a whopping 40% claiming to have spent money on doomsday supplies in the past year. The survey of 2,179 U.S. adults was conducted from January 9th to February 17th and has a 2% margin of error. Finder, who has been collecting prepping data since 2017, asked people if they had spent money prepping for emergencies over the last 12 months. Across all generations, food and water was the most commonly bought prepping item, and 20% of Gen Z preppers purchased toilet paper. According to the latest survey, 29% of Americans spent money on prepping, up from the roughly 25% who did in 2017. Many doomsday preppers said they are taking precautions ahead of the 2024 election because they are concerned it will bring civil unrest, while others worry the government will botch its response to the next big natural disaster. They're right. They're completely right about all of it. The 40% that are buying. I'm sure there are more that think it's going to happen too. The government will botch a response to a natural disaster. They got a photo here of the Superdome in New Orleans. Yeah, we get it. You cannot rely on government. Based Gen Z outright being like, I'm not going to rely on government in a disaster. How many older people are just like, nah, we'll be fine. Government will take care of it. I'm not interested in that. They're also right about potential unrest in 2024. Not that they're saying outright civil war, but I can respect it. Look at this. What's this one? Is this from the Summer of Love? Man, I wonder how many young people fear mass rioting. But here's where it gets oh so juicy. A large component, it's actually climate change narratives. Really? I got to adjust my pitch. All right. In the event I get any leftists watching this channel, my friends, climate change is going to make the oceans rise by 20 feet. There'll be no farmland. What are you going to eat? Safeandreadymeals.com. I'm kidding. I should adjust my pitch for the left, though. Are you concerned about civil war in 2024? Buy food. And leftists, are you concerned about climate change? Buy food. Nah, look, the reason why I only do the shout outs when there's actual disasters is I don't know. I don't like I don't mind doing promos for like, castbrew.com is our coffee. Yeah, we drink coffee all the time. But I think when people are watching a disaster unfold, it's the opportune moment to tell people this is why you need to be prepared, right? It is the perfect sales pitch, but it's not about just making money. It's like, look, there's a ton of times, many instances where you could promote emergency food or whatever. The reality is, I genuinely think people should have this stuff. There are certain things I think you should have so you survive. What better time to tell someone, hey, here's an example of what might happen. Please pay attention. So I do think it is important. And look at these, man. I got to tell you, look, millennials are broken. The boomers are great. I really do like boomers, but there's a lot of bad boomers, whatever. There's bad people in every generation. But if I was going to do a breakdown, I'd say like the boomers, man, they did great stuff. Okay. Start with the next generation. And the Gen Xers who interned on those projects, good for you. Gen X helped bring us The Simpsons along with boomers. funny in the 90s. Season 9 was really the last good one. But a lot of great stuff from Boomers and Gen X. Oh, man, great Gen X music. Can we be real? Smashing Pumpkins. Let's roll, baby. Then Millennials came about. And it's muddled garbage. Sorry, it is. Look, we can break down exactly what's wrong with Millennials, but I'll tell you, that poll I covered a couple weeks ago, where Boomers, Gen X, and Gen Z all said, I'm satisfied with $120,000 a year, and Millennials were like, I want $550,000. That's absolutely insane. Millennials think in order to be happy, they need $550,000 a year. What? And some people have said, well, it's because Millennials went through 2 economic crises. And I don't know, man. Here's what I think. I got a head start. So I'm probably closer to the Gen X camp. As long as I've been alive, I've had the internet. So I had a leap over the millennial generation or whatever. Something about the way millennials grew up and then got the internet when they were like 13 or whatever really messed them up. So millennials, we're talking about mid to late 80s on average when they're around the time they're born. And the ubiquity of the internet is really like emerging in the early 2000s and then 2007 with cell phones. For me, I had the internet my whole life. So I'm constantly exposed to this, but it could be the people who are online in like 1992 are going to be working professionals and tech people, not your average person, which is why when Reddit first launched, it was very tech centric. The ideas around all of these default forums, if you're not familiar with Reddit is, were based on what Silicon Valley people were into, and it was fairly libertarian. Maybe that's it. Millennials end up becoming some weird broken generation, and Gen Z is paying attention. So maybe Gen Z is paying attention to videos like this. And again, I know that Gen Z is split in half, millennials too, and it's only going to get more pronounced. However, there's been a hard fork in American society, and this hard fork will result in a much, much more conservative future. That's why I think it's important to bring up Gen Z being the most conservative generation ever. They're not going to be the most conservative generation ever in terms of, but I think it's fair to rephrase this. Obviously, the boomers are more conservative than Gen Z. However, in terms of what it means to be conservative moving forward, conservative typically refer to conserving traditional values and things like this versus progressive, which is trying to progress society. Now, I don't think those words are accurate in what they describe, but that's generally what people mean. Typically, the younger generations adopt newer, more radical views that oppose the older generations. Only now, Gen Z may be the most conservative generation ever. And what that means is, it doesn't mean they're more politically right-leaning or traditional than the silent generation or the boomers. It means in terms of what would be defined as conservation or progression, they are leaning more towards conservation. So while they are very progressive, the shift typically from generation to, let me put it this way. Let's say every generation is a 5-point shift left. That is progressive, right? Gen Z has a minus 1% or a positive shift to the right, meaning the shift was more conservative than any generation before it, though their views are still fairly progressive compared to other generations. You get my point? They're more likely to believe in traditional values, even if those traditional values are like from the 90s, as opposed to, say, the boomers or the silent generation were. The silent generation has who are the kids? The boomers had the millennials, and the silent generation had the Gen Xers, I think. Is that how it goes? I don't know. I don't know how to track these generations. It comes and goes in waves, right? But you get my point. Gen Z may not be, if you were to take an old person and a Gen Z person, you're going to be like, old person's way more conservative. But if you were to compare the progress of human society, you'd be like conservatives shifted, Gen Z shifted way more conservative than any generation before them. Here we go. USA Today. Could the 2024 election cause society to collapse? Some preppers think so, and they're ready. I wonder what the age of these preppers are. Give me some information. What do we got? Brett Wagner to the windows of her home in North Carolina and sees disaster coming. Not immediately, but someday. Okay, well, she's 39, a millennial. Wagner, 39, represents a relatively small but growing segment of Americans who consider themselves preppers. People prepared to survive without government assistance during disasters. Those disasters could encompass anything from a major storm to widespread looting sparked by election anger. You see, this narrative once again is emerging, but this is what I want to highlight. Now go back to Gen Z, 40% prepping. That means you have potentially a plurality of Gen Z that does not trust the government. So are they progressive? Are they socialist? I don't think so. Don't ask me why. I don't know, but I don't think so. Here we go. The Wire says U.S. careening towards the abyss of fascistic violence and civil war as election 2024 approaches. Oh, it would not be complete without that. From Politico, here we go. The threat of civil breakdown is real. National security officials are still not prepared for a far-right revolt. Okay. The New Statesman. Oh, man. Here's a leftist publication saying, is Gen Z the most conservative generation in history? Why teens and 20-somethings could fuel the next Tory revival. And this is British. But of course, we would not be Timcast if we were not fair and balanced, which is why I give you from the New York Times, just from October. Millennials and Gen Z are tilting left and staying there. Really? Jamel Bowie writes, there's an old saying that if you're not liberal when you're young, then you have no heart. And if you're not conservative when you're old, you have no brain. No. Can we fix this one? Learn the phrase, okay? It's alliterative. If you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're not conservative when you're old, you have no head. Duh, it's head and heart, not heart and brain. Learn your alliterations. The idea, of course, is that liberalism is a game for the youth and that age brings security, stability, and natural resistance to change. The upshot in American politics is that while most voters might start center left, with Democrats, they'll end their political journey center right with Republicans. That's the story. The reality is a little more complicated. Not only does our narrative of political change over time exaggerate the degree of rightward drift among different people as they age, but there's good evidence for the youngest generations of Americans it's hardly happening at all. The evidence comes from a new Wall Street Journal analysis of the latest data from General Social Survey, a comprehensive examination of American attitudes and beliefs conducted since its creation in 1972 by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. It is true, according to those researchers, that those voters typically become more conservative as they get older, which is to say as they gain income, buy property, and start families. But the extent of the drift, or where it finally reaches, depends on where they start. Okay, let me slow it down. People aren't having kids anymore. It's kids that makes you more conservative. It's when you're like, hey, I got to support my kids. They need food. They need diapers. They need shelter. No longer can I sleep on a park bench. It's not about me. It's about them. And then you look at your taxes and you're like, whoa, how much money am I giving to the government? And for what? They're blowing up. Who? Look, man, people just want to feed their kids. Here's the thing. I had a conversation with a liberal friend of mine who was totally pro-abortion to the point of birth. She has no kids. She also did not care that they're showing kids graphic sexual content in school. No kids. And I said, well, it's really easy. You don't have kids. You don't care. Other people with kids are scared that their kids are being attacked and threatened because they are. That's really it. I'd be willing to bet that if you were to do a survey, they would say conservatives are more likely to have kids. I'm willing to bet it's that people who have kids are more likely to be conservative. Meaning that before kids, they could be liberal. After kids, they're conservative. It's also that question about women who get married are more likely to be conservative. Is the question that when women get married, they become conservative? Or is it that if women are conservative, they get married? You see how this works. Here's what I think. I don't think millennials and Gen Z are tilting left and staying there. I think there is a portion, as I mentioned, of the bifurcated generation where some are progressive and they're not having kids, so their worldview isn't changing. What's going to happen when they're older and need someone to take care of them? Their views on government assistance will be emboldened. For those with kids, they'll say, my kids will help me out. For those without, they'll say, I need the government to do this. You see where this is going. It is people not having kids, which is creating a massive bifurcation. All in all, however, I think the data shows that Gen Z is more conservative than any other generation. I think it is fair to say, but I want to make sure I'm clear on what this means. Gen Z is the most conservative generation we've seen out of the past 6 or 7 generations, meaning, to clarify once again, if you took a 70-year-old and a Gen Zer, their views would be wildly different. The Gen Zer would be way more left-leaning in terms of what it means to be conservative, right? If you look at the 1600s when dueling was commonplace, call that traditional. Long gone, right? If you compared someone from the 1600s to someone who is 70 years old today, the 70-year-old would be progressive. The point being, every generation shifts a certain amount of degrees to the left, as we would perceive it, I suppose, or towards progressivism. It would appear that from silent, boomer, Gen X, millennial to Gen Z, Gen Z actually inverted it for the first time ever. And this was data that came out in 2018, and we're seeing it more and more and more. That typically generations will move leftward, but Gen Z actually ticked slightly rightward, making them more conservative than any other generation before it, because conservative to progressive is relative to generation before it. I don't know what that means moving forward. I mean, I think we're on track for a conservative Christian nation, or Muslim nation, to be completely honest, but Abrahamic and conservative based on these facts. I think based on birth rates, we're looking at Christian, because people also mention, yeah, but what about immigration? A lot of these immigrants are Christian too. So I guess, you know what? We'll see. But as the years go on now, being 5 or 6 years since that study came out, it's only being proven more and more. So 2024 will be interesting, but I'm really interested in what 2028 will be. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.